In this video, I'll be showing you how to make your own paper from scraps of recycled paper that you can just find around the house. So I've pre-torn all of these up and we're just going to soak them in some water. There is another part to this video where I show you how to make a Declan Frame, so if you want to see how to do that you can always turn this off and go back to that one, but you can just stick with this if you prefer. So all of these bits of paper have bits of printing on them and all sorts, so it won't be an entirely white sheet of paper. It'll be a bit of a muddier colour, maybe a slight purple tinge to it, but you can always add tissue paper and stuff like that to change the colour. It's best to soak your paper for about an hour before working with it because you'll just get a much smoother, flatter piece of paper afterwards. At the moment I'm getting loads of scraps of paper ready and pushing them down into the water so that they get really well soaked, but you can do this with much less if you're just wanting to make a couple of sheets. But as I'm going to show you how to do lots of different types of things with this, I figured it was best to have loads of paper pulp ready. So you can miss this step, but I'm going to add a little bit of Aquapel Size, which is from a website called Specialist Craft. And this stuff just makes your paper that little bit just stronger, a bit more water resistant, and holds it together a bit more. So you only need a tiny bit of that, so I've just put a teeny tiny slosh in, and it's kind of like a milky colour when it goes in, so you want to put that in and give it a really good stir just to make sure it's soaking into everything, and then leave it for over an hour if you can. Preferably overnight as well works really well, but if you don't want to wait you can do it straight away too. You can add all sorts of different decorative elements as well, so these are loads of different petals that I got from Decorative Crafts. That's some Postit Notes which are nice and neon, feathers, leaves, bits of twine, all sorts of things. So these bits here are just kind of some punchings from a hole punch, so they look really lovely and give you a polka dot effect. You can add bits of greenery, little scraps of paper, just anything you like really. There's already a feather floating in my water, so that's going to get used in something later. You can add tea as well, that's always quite interesting, and spices are always quite good, like cumin looks really good in this, and leaves and all sorts. So when you're ready, you're going to get a blender and just attack it really, just blitz it, make it as fine as possible. Sometimes it takes quite a while to grind it all down enough. By the end it should look like quite a thin watery porridge with lots of lumps in, so you just want to keep blending it up and it should look sort of like this. And if it's not looking that thin, I'd get a little bit more water and just add it to it, just so it's a little bit easier to blend. And you'll keep seeing little bits of whole paper popping up, so you just want to make sure that you blend those ones up as well. So the next thing you need is a Declan Frame. So I've got another video showing you how to make this, and it's pretty easy to do with frames around your house and if you've got some mesh. So this one's made out of an actual papermaking mesh, which should work really nicely. So you get a big scoop of that. So generally I'd say kind of if you're using a ladle this sort of size, you get a scoop and then an extra half a scoop. And I'll show you why in a second, because if you do it with only one, it can end up a bit thin. And I know my water bath's a bit of a mucky colour, just because the last time I did this it was with a big group of school kids and I didn't realise there was still some dye in the bottom of the plastic tubs, but that's okay. It shouldn't really affect it too much, if anything it will make it interesting. So you put it in, move it about and then put your frame in and kind of scoop it out. So your Declan Frame comes in two parts, so you've got the bit with mesh, so you want that facing upwards, and then the other bit on top to give it that A4 shape. So with this I'm just sprinkling some little bits of twine offcuts on top of it, just to give it a nice decorative finish, putting it back in the water, giving it a shuffle, and if it goes all over the place just kind of dip it back in and rearrange, and that's picked up that feather as well. So then I would let it drip for a few minutes just so that it's just easier to control really. So if I hold that up to the light you can see that it's quite a thin piece of paper. So then you'll need some bits of felt or just anything spongy that will absorb lots of water, and then I always get a J cloth just because they don't have much texture to them, so it shouldn't take on that kind of form. You might get a few wrinkles, but other than that, nothing. So then you get your frame and tip it onto the J cloth so that the paper side faces down. And then you get a sponge and you're just going to kind of sponge out the excess water. And what this does is it pushes the paper out of that frame, as well as getting rid of some of the water, so it's going to take it less time to dry, but this still does take quite a long time to dry. And I'd make sure when you're doing that you don't kind of like rub across it, because sometimes that can get it stuck. And then give your frame a wiggle and it should come off quite easily. With some things it will be a little bit harder to do. So that's a really, really thin bit of paper, so next time we're going to add a little bit more of the paper pulp. So I'm just making a note here that this one is with the papermaking mesh, so that I can show you later what they look like when you take them out, because all of the frames we're going to use today will have a slightly different texture, slightly different benefits and things, so it's just a good way to show you how they differ. So then you get another J cloth to go on top of that, so you're creating a kind of sandwich with it, and then a few more sheets of felt or just anything really absorbent just to kind of soak the water out of it and press a little bit out of it as you go. Then find something heavy, so I'm using some A4 sheets of wood, so you're going to put one on the top and one on the bottom. And what I tend to do is, with all of my paper making, I'll just stack it all up, and then towards the end I'll push the water out and then stand on it for a little while I'm tidying up, just so it forces a little bit more out of it. So for this one I'm going to add some of those hole punch pieces just straight into the water vat, just so that it kind of integrates a little bit more, because some of these are quite thick, so it's good to have it in the water at the same time. So for this piece of paper we've used 1.5 ladles full of paper pulp, so I can already see from that it's way thicker and just a much more substantial piece of paper. So we're going to see how this one looks. So now we're going to use a muslin frame. So with this, it's always good to give it a little spray with hairspray, because it's so fine and like quite fibrous, so the paper pulp tends to stick to it quite a lot. So for this bit we'll be doing the exact same thing as before. So I'm going to speed it up a little bit and then I'll show you the difference when you come to turn the paper out at the end. For this one I'll also be adding some little bits of ripped up Post-it notes, because they're such nice neon colours that they give a really nice effect to it and look a bit like confetti. Sometimes when you do this there'll be little blank spots on your frame, so best thing to do is just get some water and go over it so it kind of redistributes all of that paper pulp like this. So turning the paper out for this one is much trickier because it tends to get way more stuck on this frame than anything else. So you want to really make sure as you're sponging out excess water with this that you're just pressing downwards rather than moving it about, because if you kind of shuffle it about too much it can get it really stuck in the fibres of the muslin. So when I hold this up you'll probably be able to see there's a few little blank sections, so that's just where I didn't put enough paper in, and when I tried to change it while it was on the frame it probably just moved some of the pulp out of the way, so you just want to be always a little bit careful with that. So you can probably see here that whereas with the other one it came out really easily, with this one I'm having to like press it down a little bit to get it to disconnect. So it takes a lot of wobbling, a lot of pushing the corners down, and it can just be quite tricky. So if it's really not going, you can lift it up and kind of roll some of the edges a little bit just to encourage it to disconnect. And this time it's just really decided it doesn't want to cooperate, so I'm just going to put it to one side like that and peel it off when it's completely dry. So now that I've got a little bit further down in the paper pulp, there's way more bits that have just got a bit compressed and haven't really blended all that well, so sometimes you have to re-blend it as you go a little bit. So for this one we're going to use some netting, which I use quite a lot because it's quite easy to come by and it's not as expensive as other materials, although sometimes it does get a little bit stuck with this stuff. So for this one we'll be adding a couple of rose petals. So this smells absolutely amazing as well, which is a nice added bonus. So this one should be quite easy to turn out, but it can sometimes take a little bit of extra work. Again with this one you might have to push down the edges a bit and sometimes it might split. So sometimes it can split a little bit as you take it off the frame, and if you're quick with it before it dries you can kind of piece it back together and push it together, but you might still sometimes get a little ridge from it. So this next one we'll be doing is a quite loose weave metal frame. So this isn't my favourite because it gives you quite a kind of chunky finish to your paper, but it's something that you never know, you might have around the house already, so it's quite a good thing to use for it. So for this one I'm going to add some grass in, just because why not? So with this it's good to put it in, add a bit more water and then blend it up again. It sometimes gets quite stuck around the blade, so it should end up looking like that and be like quite chunky. Every so often when you take it away one bit will get stuck to the frame, so sometimes you'll get little tears in it, and you can kind of push it back together to a certain extent, but it will often have a little ridge in it afterwards. So sometimes with these pieces I'll just put them back into the paper pulp vat to just use them again. For the next one I'm going to add some tissue paper in, and it should hopefully change the colour of the paper, because tissue paper has so much dye in it that often when you add it to water it just soaks it all out. For this next one I'll be using a tighter wire mesh, so this should give it a much smoother surface, but sometimes it can be a little bit trickier to get it off the frame. So you can sort of see that that paper pulp has got a little bit more bluey, like it's just got an ever so slight blue tinge to it, and that's just from the tissue paper, and there's loads of stuff left in that vat, so there's all sorts of different bits from all of the other ones, so it should have quite an interesting build up of bits and bobs in there. So I can already see there's a bit of a tear in this paper, and the frame on this one isn't quite as tight, so when you make your Declan frame, it's really good to make sure that it's pulled really tight like a drum, and that you staple it around the edges as well, and that can stop that kind of sagging a bit, and it reduces the likelihood of breaks in your paper. So I'm going to do another version here with a bit more tissue paper to hopefully give it a more kind of purpley tinge. As you add more materials to your paper pulp, it's always good to put in a little bit more water as you go, just to make sure it blends up a little bit easier. So with this one, there's quite a lot of leftover bits of paper pulp in the water vat, so it's going to end up being quite a thick bit of paper. So I can see as I'm lifting this up, it's got just way more bulk to it, so it's kind of a little bit easier to handle. So when you're starting out, if you want to use a bit more paper pulp, go for it. When it comes to emptying your water vat, it's really good to have a sieve to hand, just because if you pour this straight down a drain, it's going to block it. So with this, I'm just using it as an example. So you just pour it through really, really slowly, and the sieve will filter out all of that paper pulp. And what will be left is like a really good ball of paper pulp that you can use for other things. Or sometimes it's quite interesting as well, if you just leave it in the sieve, you get a really interesting kind of like paper bowl effect. A really nice thing you can do as well is get some seeds and add this to your paper pulp, and then when it dries you can break it up and give it away to people as a nice way to plant things. And because all of this is biodegradable, it can just go straight into soil and it works really well. Once you've finished all your paper making, next best thing to do is stack them all up, get some heavy things and just push down on it to squeeze as much of that water out as possible. Once it's all squeezed out, I would recommend laying them flat like this so that it can air dry really nicely. They do take quite a long time to dry, these sheets of paper. And then once they're a little bit drier again, I would put them on the line. If it's too windy, I wouldn't, because you can see one there, it's already flopped over a little bit and broken. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll be doing another quick one soon to show you a comparison of how these all look in the end from all of the different frames. You can find out more about all of my workshops at Darn It Workshops on absolutely everything. If you're enjoying these videos, I have a Ko-fi account and a Patreon in case you want to help out so I can make a few more. Thank you, bye!